Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the PCC, Colonization and Residential Schools. This has been prepared by the Life and Mission Agency of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and we're glad that everyone is able to join us here today. My name is Allison Carr, and I am the Associate Secretary of Justice Ministries at the Presbyterian Church in Canada. I'm a white immigrant settler. To give you a bit of background on where I'm speaking from, how I'm located, and what my identity is, and today we'll be discussing the church's legacy. This webinar is being recorded, just so you know, and it will be posted later, so you'll be able to access it on the Indigenous Justice page of the PCC's Social Action Hub, which you see at the address in front of you on the screen. Your videos are currently turned off, as well as your mics, and the chat function is also going to be turned off. But they will, however, be turned on again at the end of the webinar once we turn the recording off. And at that point, there will be time for questions. So please do know that there will be a chance to ask those if you have them. We are gathered here today from many places across what is now called Canada. And I am speaking today from Ajax, Ontario, which is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe, specifically the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, who were signatories of the Gunshot Treaty of 1788 and the Williams Treaty of 1923, both of which encompass where the town of Ajax is today. I acknowledge the importance of the land to the nations and peoples who were first here, not only to their culture, to spirituality, to the relationships that they had with each other, with the land, and also for the care that those First Nations have shown the land and continue to show. As we move through this webinar, please consider on whose traditional territory you now reside and the treaties, if any, that hold it. A first note, as we move through this webinar, you will see we'll be dealing with some very difficult and offensive material. And you will see on the screen in front of you quotes that are intended to show the church's history, the church's some of the church's attitudes that are shaping or did shape the way that the church engaged in work and relationship with Indigenous people. Some of that language is racist and offensive. And so you'll notice that when I read from some of the quotes, which I will do, I will be censoring some of the language or changing some of it as I read. However, we felt it was important to leave the original language up on the screen so that you would be able to see the attitudes that were shaping the church's actions at the time in their original language. At this moment, also in the webinar, we will be hearing about the incredibly harmful impacts of residential schools on generations of Indigenous people. Some of those children who attended the residential schools never made it home from the schools. Others did, but lived with lasting trauma or live with it still, affecting not only them, but their families, their children, sometimes grandchildren even. So at this point, we're going to have a moment of silence to remember and to honor the lives of all who the schools harmed. Please join me in that moment of silence. As I mentioned a moment ago, this is going to be some difficult and uncomfortable material that we'll be working through. And so I encourage everyone to be aware of how it is impacting you. It will impact each of us in different ways. Please know that sometimes emotions can be very difficult to sit with, but it can be good to sit with those emotions, and they can run quite a range. So as we work through this material today, please do be aware of how you're impacted by what we're hearing today. And then also take a chance after the webinar to spend some time reflecting on it. So some of the things that are going to be the commitments that are framing this webinar, it's important to look at before we begin. I've put two of the particular commitments that are undergirding this webinar on the screen in front of you. The first is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action number 59, and that is, I'll read it out here. We call upon church parties to the settlement agreement to develop ongoing education strategies to ensure that their respective congregations learn about the church's role in colonization, the history and legacy of residential schools, and why apologies to former residential school students, their families, and communities were necessary. So that's one of the commitments that is framing this particular webinar. Another one you see in front of you as well is a recommendation that was adopted by the General Assembly that sessions, presbyteries, and committees of the General Assembly be encouraged to learn more about colonialism and the impacts of intergenerational trauma. As we get started, we'll be focusing today for most of the webinar on what has happened post-European contact here in what is called Canada today. But it's very important to remember and acknowledge that Indigenous nations had very vibrant societies, cultures, and complex internation relationships, agreements, spiritualities, and trade long prior to European contact. The best way to learn about the vibrant societies of Indigenous nations is from Indigenous people themselves, from elders, knowledge keepers, artisans, academics, and many others. So I do encourage everyone to do that. But in this webinar, we will be focusing on the church's relationship and the church's actions. So 4 things that we'll discuss today. First, we will go through a brief discussion of colonialism, the doctrine of discovery, and the concept of terra nullius. From there, we will move into the PCC's legacy of residential schools and some of the things that happened to the schools. Following that, we'll look at the legacy of trauma and intergenerational trauma that colonization and the schools fostered. And then finally, we will end on the church's present path and the church's present work towards reconciliation. So we'll begin with a discussion of colonialism and the doctrine of discovery. First, it's important to have some grounding in what colonialism is. So you'll see on the screen in front of you a definition of colonialism from the Oxford Dictionary. The policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. And that last bit there that you see on the screen, exploiting it economically, is something that we'll discuss at different points in this webinar, so I draw your attention to it now. Another thing that is very important to keep in mind as we're moving through this webinar, colonialism is something that happened certainly not just here in what we now call Canada, but across the world in many different places and by several different means. So this presentation will focus on colonization as it unfolded here, but it's important to remember that people all over the world have experienced colonization in different ways. And sometimes, people who are here today in Canada will have experienced colonization from other places from which they have immigrated. The other thing that's very, very vital to keep in our minds as we move forward is that often, to the detriment of the church's witness, the church's mission work was tied in some very specific ways to colonization. So with that, we'll take a look at the roots of how the church was engaged in colonialism and colonization, and that is initially through what's called the doctrine of discovery. What you see in front of you is are images of two particular popes, and we'll look at some proclamations that were put out by them in a moment from excerpts of them. And this doctrine is called a collection of some of those proclamations, which were called papal bulls. So the first papal bull that we'll be looking at today, just briefly, is from a papal bull called Dum Diversus, written by Nicholas V. You can see the date there, 1452. And this particular bull was a proclamation that was granting a certain set of things to, at that point, the King of Portugal. So I'll just draw your attention to some of the language that is bolded there on the screen. The Pope Nicholas V was giving the King of Portugal, he says, full and free power to invade, to conquer, to fight, and to subjugate enemies of Christ, he says, which he uses particular designations for, and to lead their persons in perpetual servitude. And you'll note, if you go and look at some other English translations of this, which was of course written in Latin originally, some of the translations will say perpetual slavery. And the papal bull continues. The King of Portugal can appropriate the realms, the principalities, the dominions, the possessions, and the goods of the people that they that the church is giving them the authority to invade and subjugate, and then to take those things and keep them. It says for your use and for your successors. So this is again something that's happening in perpetuity. The next papal bull that we're going to look at is from a little bit later, and we're going to look at 3 different excerpts of it. This is the first. So this is written by Pope Alexander the Sixth, and you'll note that the year here is 1493. So 1493 is, of course, the year after Columbus will have returned from his voyage. And so this particular papal bull, called Inter Caetera, is in response to Columbus's voyage. You'll see on the screen in front of you that the Pope is reacting to to the encounters that Columbus had, and that he said that there are many people there who are living in peace that Columbus encountered. The Pope notes that by all the reports, the people that were encountered there believe in one God. Nevertheless, the Pope says that they seem sufficiently disposed to embrace the Catholic faith. So we're already turning at this point to conversion into a particular set of spiritual beliefs. And I'll also draw your attention to that bolded phrase, to be trained in good morals. So despite the fact, as you can see here on the screen, that the people Columbus encountered were living in peace, there was still this attitude that they needed to be trained, and that the church is the place to do that. This next excerpt from that same papal bull, Inter Caetera, then starts talking about some of the other things that were encountered when Columbus went on that voyage, namely resources. So you see on the screen in front of you that bolded language in those islands, and the word discovered right there. So this is where the doctrine of discovery is coming from. In those islands are found gold, spices, and very many other precious things of diverse kinds and qualities. So here we're lifting up the resources. The Pope is mentioning them in this papal bull, and then sets that in the context of spreading the Catholic faith, and then says, these resources that have been found here, that already exist there, we give, grant, and assign to you, the kings of Spain, and to your heirs and your successors forever. So again, that notion of in perpetuity. All the dominions, all the cities, all the camps, all the places, villages, and all rights of this land that Columbus encountered. And then you can see on the screen at the bottom just how broad and that land grant that the Pope is naming is, from the Arctic Pole to the Antarctic Pole, and that's quite a lot of land. The third excerpt that we'll be looking at from the same papal bull, Inter Caetera, again, Pope Alexander VI, says that there's only one caveat that he's giving to this grant that he's just given to the King of Spain, and that is that if there is already a Christian prince in the area, that you cannot take things away from anyone who is already a Christian at the time that this papal bull was issued. So that doesn't have anything to do with anyone who might convert later. But he says, if there is already a Christian prince there that we just don't know about, you can't take things from that prince. But if they're not Christian, then go ahead. So the last thing I'll draw your attention to, with having looked at those particular attitudes, is the last thing that you see bolded at the bottom of the screen there. Should anyone presume to attempt to contravene, to not follow, to stop, what the Pope is saying here, be it known to him that he will incur the wrath of Almighty God and of the blessed apostles Peter and Paul. So the Pope, when he issued this particular papal bull, is setting it in the context of, it's not just him speaking. He's saying the weight of the church, the weight of the tradition, and the weight of divine wrath of God is behind what I am saying here. So it's not just me saying this. This is the will of God. So with that very, very brief exploration of some of the themes in the doctrine of discovery that you saw as we looked through the text of the papal bulls that constitute it, we can take some key points on how colonialism stemming from the doctrine of discovery shaped the church. The first, it's quite clear that it wove Christian religion with the state, with state power, and specifically with state-sponsored violence. If the Pope is saying you're free to invade, you're free to subjugate, you're free to take, then that's what's going on there. The second thing is that it conflated Christian witness with Western European values and with Western European spiritual practice. And we saw that in that first excerpt from Inter Caetera that we looked at, where the Pope spoke of training in good morals and converting to Christianity. So the third thing that we can see, having looked at these excerpts of the papal bulls, is that it invested in a racist ideology that Western European people and ideals are the best and most civilized. And that, again, we've seen throughout some of those excerpts. At this point, it's worth asking. Okay, so that was what was happening in the Catholic Church at the time, which was we were talking about the 1400s here. The Presbyterian Church, of course, did not exist yet at that point. This is prior to the Reformation. So we are coming out of that of Catholicism. So Catholicism was most of what constituted Christianity, not all of it, but most of it in the 1400s. But how did this doctrine affect Presbyterian policy and practice once the Presbyterian Church did begin to exist in Canada? So now what we're looking at are some quotes from different missionaries and other people in the church who were engaged in work with and relationship with Indigenous people as the church moved west across Canada. So the first quote that we're looking at here is a letter from the Reverend James Nisbet. This is, you can find this in the Home and Foreign Record of the Canada Presbyterian Church. He's writing to the Sabbath schools. And you can see that he is thanking them because they've made some contributions, some financial contributions to the work that Reverend James Nisbet is doing. He says, thank you for the $680 that you've sent out here, which is a sizable amount for the time. He notes, could you just see the number of Indigenous children who are camped around us at this time and who are being brought up amid the follies and superstitions, as the words he's using. You would allow that your efforts in sending the money are not misspent. And he speaks about raising the children that are camped around him, the Indigenous children camped around him, from what he calls their present degradation. Even more so, I will draw your attention to the second paragraph there, where he says, the children and families who are camped around him right now, towards the end of the paragraph, you'll see they see many things that cause them to wonder and must fill them with an idea of the superiority of the white people, Reverend Nisbet's words, and that may induce them to think well also of the religion that white people bring to them. So in this particular letter, we can see the attitudes that were shaping some of the missionary work that was happening at the time, and we can see right away the linkage not only of Christianity with, in this case, with whiteness, and also claims to white superiority. The next quote that we're looking at here is from the Foreign Missions Committee report, 1908. You can see that this particular report, as it was detailing some of the things for the General Assembly, that it's looking at how land and wealth are tied together. You can see the racist attitudes that are encompassed in this report. So, for example, it says, when the Dominion of Canada was extended westward, so as settlers continued to move west, it says no one could think for a moment of leaving half a continent in the possession of a race incapable of extracting from it more than the merest pittance of its wealth. So again, that's a quote. And again, we're seeing that that resource extraction named just right out, and that sense of exploiting, right? It goes on. The report goes on. Our race took from the Indigenous person that which is enriching us. At our approach, the buffalo and the elk on which they had lived vanished, and they were left without food. We destroyed their living, the report says. And then it asks, must we then not help? So what was the help that this particular report is offering, and which indeed the church, what it was labeling as help, was already engaged in? This is when we will turn to the PCC's legacy of residential schools. So the help that the report was speaking of, what it labeled help, was this racist notion of civilizing Christianity that was the founding groundwork for the residential schools that the church operated. The church operated them at the behest of the federal government and in cooperation with them, but we were the people who were in charge of running the schools. And of course, not just the Presbyterian Church in Canada, the United Church of Canada, the Anglican Church, and different Catholic organizations also operated residential schools. The Presbyterian Church in Canada ran 12 residential schools, and you can see on the map in front of you the approximate locations of where those schools that we operated were. And I will take a moment and read the list of schools that we operated. That was Howsett Residential School in British Columbia, Alberni Residential School, also in British Columbia, Birtle Residential School in Manitoba, Cecilia Jeffrey Residential School at Shoal Lake, Ontario, Cecilia Jeffrey Residential School in Kenora, Ontario, Crowstand Residential School in Saskatchewan, File Hills Residential School in Saskatchewan, Muscopeding, later known as Lakes End Residential School in Saskatchewan, Portage la Prairie Residential School in Manitoba, Regina Industrial School in Saskatchewan, Round Lake Residential School in Saskatchewan, and Stony Plain Residential School in Alberta. In 1925, all of the schools that the Presbyterians ran, which were still open, except 2, were turned over to the United Church of Canada. And so there are some schools in this list that were run at some times by Presbyterians and then later by the United Church. The 2 schools that the Presbyterian Church in Canada continued to run after 1925 were Cecilia Jeffrey and Birtle. It's clear from some of the things that we've heard earlier, but it will become even more clear from some of the quotes that we're about to look at, that the schools were purposefully set up as tools of assimilation into the dominant culture. And so we'll take a moment and we'll look at some of the attitudes that were shaping that. But first, it's important to say that forced assimilation went well beyond the schools. And that the schools were part of a broader government-administered system of colonization. There are some of the important aspects of which included the Indian Act, as well as the pass system, forced relocation, different things with the healthcare system, just to name a few. Churches' roles, however, typically centered on the schools. So you see before you a quote from the Foreign Missions Committee report in 1889, and we'll be looking at some of the earlier quotes to get a sense of the attitudes that helped set up the schools. Here we see on the screen that the writer is saying that it is in the school, and especially in the industrial school, which was an earlier name for residential schools, that the great work of the church for what it refers to as the elevation of Indigenous people must be done. You'll see that it notes that children should be withdrawn for long periods from their families. It says the longer the better, and it labels their families and their contexts degrading surroundings. It says that it says that that the church must place Indigenous children under the direct influence of what it calls all that is noblest and best in our Christian civilization. And then it says that it confidently expects that doing so will mean that the children who are trained under these influences will be, as it says, immeasurably superior to their parents. So you can see the types of attitudes that are present in setting up the schools that continued throughout the schools, and you can see how going in with these kind of attitudes are going to set up a system that from the beginning is going to be harming. This is a quote from a little bit later, still the Foreign Missions Committee report. It notes that the institution is still under the same management as it was in a previous report, but I'll draw your attention to that bolded quote again. That from the beginning, the people running this particular school have aimed at separating the children as much as possible from their old, it calls them heathen surroundings. And that now, it says there are in the school boys who have not been absent from it for a single night for nearly 3 years. So this is an example of what is meant when some of the sources are saying the longer the better. We can see from some of the materials that we've just looked at and others that we could look at but don't have time to do so today, that the church conflated assimilation with its witness as the body of Christ and with its mission. This is one quote that we could look at others if we had more time, but this is from the 1914 Home and Missions Board report from the Synod of British Columbia, as you see. And it is talking about how the work of the church will not work. It will not be effectual unless education is made compulsory. And unless these particular spiritual practices and parts of cultural and spiritual identity that it mentions are taken away and forbidden. And then again, there's that notion of training that you see as well. So the Indigenous people must be trained to make their living by some what it calls industrial activity. So those are the kinds of attitudes that shaped the residential school system throughout, from the very beginning and then continuing. We won't get into particular incidences in this webinar, but these are some of the things that you see on the screen before you that we know, that we are now aware happened at Presbyterian-run institutions. So not just at residential schools generally, but at Presbyterian ones. We know that there was physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. We know that there was, of course, lack of contact with family. That was very clearly stated in many of the things that we've looked at already. You may or may not know that there were nutritional experiments that were run on children at, for example, Cecilia Jeffrey. This was without parental knowledge or consent, and without the children's knowledge or consent as well. And those those nutritional experiments, just to give you some context, involved withholding food. Or withholding types of food. So this was regarding malnourishment. We know that there were medical experiments on children as well at Presbyterian-run institutions. Again, Cecilia Jeffrey, and some of those medical experiments had to do with ears and caused damage to some of the children that the experiments were run on. Again, those experiments were done without parental knowledge or consent and without the children's knowledge or consent. We know that there was complete segregation of children based on gender assigned at birth. This is important to note in particular because it meant that siblings who came to the school from the same family weren't always able to even see each other at the schools, depending on the particular school and time, because if they were segregated by gender at birth, they might not be able to see their sibling hardly at all while at the school. So it was another way of breaking up family relationships. And we know that there was inadequate food provided at many of the schools, and we know of instances where, despite the inadequate food that was provided, there were kitchen staff who would sell students that might be able to afford it additional food to enrich themselves. There are many ways that children resisted the violence and harm that was done to them at the schools. And some of the children, for example, ran away from the schools. Some of those children who ran away never made it home or indeed back to the schools, but died in their attempts. Cheney Wenjack, who was born on the 19th of January, 1954, and died on the 23rd of October, 1966, is one of those children. He attended Cecilia Jeffrey in Kenora, which was a PCC-run school, ran away from it, and died of exposure on his attempted journey home. In 1994, the church confessed its role in operating residential schools and in colonization. So at the time, the church was beginning to hear more from survivors about what went on at the schools. Lawsuits were eventually, as you know, launched, but in 1994, the church did make formal confession. And what you see is an excerpt from that confession on the screen here. And you see some of the bolded words there cover some of the same things that we saw spoken of in the earlier quotes. So in the confession, we acknowledged that assimilation was the project that the schools were involved with. We acknowledged that the roots of the harm that the church did with the schools can be found in the attitudes and values of Western European colonialism. We used words like what was not yet molded in our image, we felt was to be discovered and exploited. And the church said that in its cultural arrogance, it has been blind to the ways in which our own understanding of the gospel has been culturally conditioned. The last thing I'll draw your attention to on this slide is that final phrase, that in so doing, the church has misrepresented Jesus Christ. So these are some of the parts of the confession that has been shaping the church's understanding and walk of reconciliation since it was adopted in 1994. As you probably know, in this year, in 2024, so 30 years later, the church, having spent the last 30 years in learning, in reconciliation, in trying to understand more fully the effects and harm that the residential schools have wrought, the church did make formal apology. So it was adopted in 2024, and what you see on the screen are some excerpts from that apology. That apology is available for download, as well as the confession that you saw an excerpt from just a moment before. They are on the Social Action Hub on the Indigenous Justice page under official statements of the church. So you can go and download the entire apology as well as the entire confession. And we'll look in a moment at the very end of the apology, which contains 5 foundational commitments for going forward. One of the questions that people sometimes ask, or that we sometimes hear, is that is really awful. What just happened? But that was a long time ago. What are we doing now? What is going on? And so what we're going to look at next, in the next section, the 3rd section of this webinar, is the legacy of the schools, what's happening today, trauma and intergenerational trauma. So, as is not surprising, given what we just heard and the material we just worked through about the schools and the kinds of things that happened at the schools, there is a legacy of trauma that the schools fostered that has led to intergenerational trauma for survivors and their descendants who are still dealing with the impacts of the schools on people's lives today. First, we're going to define trauma because it's helpful to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about trauma and intergenerational trauma. So what you see on the screen before you is an infographic from the Center for Healthcare Strategies on what trauma is. You can see the source down at the bottom of the page. And it notes that trauma can result from exposure to an incident or to a series of events that are so deeply emotionally disturbing or life-threatening that they can have significant adverse effects on a person's functioning, on their mental, physical, social, emotional, and also spiritual well-being. And so that's a brief definition of what trauma is. And then you can see on the screen in front of you, it lists some different experiences that are often considered traumatic. So, of course, physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, childhood neglect is listed right there. Living with family members that have mental health or substance use issues. Sudden unexplained separation from a loved one, and in particular from parents. Racism, poverty, discrimination, oppression, and violence, whether that's in the form of war or other ways. You'll see the final thing on the screen here that we're looking at from this particular infographic, and we'll be looking at several different ones, is that while trauma can happen at any time in a person's life, when trauma happens when someone is a child, it can have very serious effects because of the way that bodies operate and the way that bodies develop and grow. So we'll look at that in just a moment. But first, want to draw your attention to the words of a survivor from one of the residential schools. So this quote is from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report and the executive summary, an image of which you see on the screen there. Honoring the Truth and Reconciling for the Future is the name of that particular report. And they're all available for free download on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's site. So you can find them there. This quote, the survivor says, and compared the experience of being taken to residential schools as a form of captivity. And he said, that's when the trauma started for me, being separated from my sister, from my parents, and from our home. He says we were no longer free. And that it was like being, taken to a strange land, even though he says it was our land as I understood later on. So those are the words of a survivor. to really understand the effects of the schools, it's important to understand the effects of trauma on young children, and how those impacts continue throughout a life, well into adulthood. And so we're going to speak very briefly about something called the ACE study. So ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. We'll look at what that study is in a moment, and you'll see an image for a video that you can watch to learn more about it if you'd like to after this webinar. But first, what are adverse childhood experiences? There's a list of many of them. Some of the ones that I'll draw your attention to that the study looked at in particular is separation from or loss of a parent, experiencing violence, abuse, or neglect as a child, and also witnessing violence where one lives or in one's community, again, as a child. So the infographic that you see on the screen in front of you is from the CDC, which is the Center for Disease Control in the States. The Center for Disease Control and an organization called Kaiser Permanente ran the ACE study. It was one of the largest studies into the later life long-term effects of childhood abuse and neglect, and they found a number of things. So as you can see on the screen, they found that ACEs, so those adverse childhood experiences, that their effects can accumulate and last well beyond childhood, and that it becomes a form of toxic stress. You see on the screen in front of you, it explains that toxic stress can happen, and I'm reading the quote here from the CDC, when the brain endures repeated stress or danger, and then it releases those fight or flight hormones like cortisol that can flood your body. And then when as you see moving further down the screen, when that internal alarm system, it says, gets activated, it does things like increase your heart rate, your blood pressure, and if it gets activated over and over again, then the study notes that it can damage your digestive, your immune system, other systems in your body. So when that happens while your body is developing, it has those long-term effects that the study was looking at. And you see this next infographic is from the same source. You can see up in the corner there where the infographic can be found at. So this is again through the Center for Disease Control. But it shows some of the results of this system getting activated again and again as a child. So an increase in chronic health conditions, and you see some of those listed there, an increase in cancer, in heart disease and stroke and asthma, in other diseases, as well as an increase in what it refers to as health risk behaviors. So things like smoking, physical inactivity, substance use, etc. As well as it has what it calls social outcomes. So going through more of these adverse childhood experiences and some of the effects they have some statistical likelihood that you'll struggle more with finding employment and completing education and things of that nature. And it also, statistically speaking, increases your risk for things like depression. The last thing that I'll draw your attention to in this infographic in front of you on the screen is that the consequences of ACEs, those adverse childhood experiences, can be passed down from one generation on to the next one. And then again, if there isn't a chance for healing. And we'll look at that in a moment. This is that video that I mentioned that you can go to learn more about the ACE study and the effects that it looks at. This is a woman named Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who's an expert in the field. a pediatrician who was for a time as well the Surgeon General of California, the former Surgeon General now. So I encourage you to go and see this video. You can see the link there on the bottom of your screen. And this will be posted later, so you will be able to see it again. From what we just looked at, though, it's clear that there are many ways in which what we might consider the past, so things that have happened previously, shape people's present and are still very much present in our bodies. And so in some ways they're not actually past. And so that's why we're talking about those ongoing effects of residential schools, even long after the schools are closed. We'll just look very briefly at some Canadian statistics here, since some of the information we were looking at previously was from the United States. So this is some information put out by Statistics Canada from the General Social Survey. You can this particular chart is something that they put out, and it looks at the increased likelihood of experiencing a number of different things if you were if you experienced abuse as a child, and you can see the striking increase in that chart in front of you. So a significant increase, for example, in sexual assault, a significant increase in general assault, as well as in theft, and then even you can see a small increase in the likelihood that you would be robbed. So these are, again, just statistical likelihoods. It doesn't mean that it will happen, but it means that it's much more likely to happen and has happened with much more frequency. So something to keep in mind as we are thinking about the kinds of things that happened at the schools and the kinds of impacts that then continued in people's lives. From this quote that we're looking at on the screen here, is from a report put out by Stats Canada, profile of Canadian adults who experienced childhood maltreatment. And it notes, I'll just read it out, multivariate analysis, so looking at the data in many different ways, showed a clear association between childhood maltreatment and later violent victimization. Even when all other risk factors were taken into account, people who had experienced physical and or sexual abuse as children were at double the risk of violent victimization as adults. The lives of survivors. But that also translates into the lives of intergenerational survivors. We'll look at that in a moment. So trauma can be unintentionally handed down. And that's when the trauma that we were just looking at and some of those statistics that we just considered, if you think about what impact that would have on a survivor who became a parent or a caregiver, and then what impact that continued violence in their life might have on the generations that they are caring for, you can see how intergenerational trauma can occur when those parents or caregivers are still living with unhealed trauma or with that increased likelihood of experiencing more violence, and how that might impact the context in which that next generation is raised. This is something that was borne out by the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and we'll see the final report for that a bit later in the webinar. But what you see on the screen in front of you is a quote from the executive summary of that report and Reclaiming Power in Place. And it talks about how violence became normalized in the lives of many Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQI people that the report looked at. So violence happened, and not only did it happen, but it happened over and over to the point where it felt very normal to people. That was the word that was used to describe it. And I'll draw your attention to that last paragraph on the screen, where it says, in many of the truths shared by the witnesses that the inquiry had interviewed, it goes on, the normalization of violence could be traced back through family lines to trauma that was experienced in residential and day schools, to the 60s scoop, and to other forms of colonial violence. So that's where the roots of this violence that is shaping lives are coming from. Well, what does this mean for the church's work today? Three things really to ground what it means. The first is that the history of trauma and harm that we just spent a very brief time covering here, and much more could be said, but that history of trauma and harm is part of the church's witness. It's quite sinfully. The second thing to keep in mind in terms of what is the church's work today is that the wounds that we helped cause, that the church helped cause, are still open. So it's not just wounds that happened a long time ago, or 40 years ago, or whatever. These are wounds that are still open and that are still happening as we look through how intergenerational trauma happens. And the third thing to keep in mind, stemming from all that we've just covered, is that work for reconciliation is thus the work of everyone and anyone in the church. So with that, we'll move to the last section of the webinar, which is the church's present path and our work toward reconciliation. First, we're going to look at some key events from the last 30 years, just to give a brief timeline, and much more could be said again. But here's some of the key things. So in 1994, as we spoke about just a brief time ago, the church made formal confession for residential schools and our complicity in colonization. And at that point, the PCC entered a period of reflection and learning, in which it is still engaged. In the 2000s, there were various lawsuits that were brought against the different churches that operated residential schools and some of the Catholic orders. In 2006, the Presbyterian Church in Canada established a healing and reconciliation program. And then in 2007, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was finalized. From 2008 through 2015, the church participated in Truth and Reconciliation Commission events and processes, and in listening. And then in 2016, the General Assembly adopted a recommendation that congregations and presbyteries study the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, often referred to as UNDRIP, and that a recommendation that the church respond to the TRC's calls to action, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. As well, in 2016, reconciliation was prioritized in the church's National Strategic Plan. Moving from there, in 2019, the Presbyterian Church in Canada formally repudiated the doctrine of discovery inter nullius. We acknowledged the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the basis for right relations and the framework for reconciliation. In 2021, the General Assembly accepted the findings of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, including its finding of genocide, and encouraged congregations and individuals to respond to that inquiry's calls for justice, which it put out. The following year, and in part also in 2021, the church established the Honoring the Children Fund, that was intended to help support the work of if nations and communities, Indigenous nations and communities would like to search the grounds of former residential schools for unmarked graves. That Honoring the Children Fund is there for that, as well as for healing supports for those impacted by Presbyterian-run residential schools. In 2023, the church spent quite a bit of time pulling together information that the independent special interlocutor had requested as she is doing her work of looking into unmarked burials at the sites of former residential schools. And so those materials were submitted. And that report is expected. There's been some reports already. We'll look at them in a moment. But the sort of final recommendations that she will be putting out is expected at the end of October. And then last, in this year, 2024, the General Assembly adopted an apology for the harms of colonization and residential schools. There's a special committee of Indigenous and settler Presbyterians that prepared that apology, and that committee continues the work of developing guidance for the church about how best to animate that apology and continue the work. So what have we said and done? Here are some of the questions that we receive most frequently, and the answers to them. Of course, there'll be time for questions at the end of the webinar as well. The first question is, have we apologized? The answer to that is twofold. Yes, we have. First, we confessed in 1994, but then we made formal apology first in 2024. Did we meet the financial obligations to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement? Yes, we were a party to that agreement, and the PCC did pay all of the money that was agreed on in that settlement. One of the most frequent questions we receive is, did we turn over all of our records? Yes, we did. There was a committee from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that came into the archives that examined all of the records that the archives held related to residential schools that were in our possession, that then scanned them, and then they were submitted to the DRC. People frequently ask me if students died at PCC-run schools. The unequivocal answer is yes, they did. There is a National Memorial Student Register that lists the names of students that we know died at schools, and you'll see many listed at Presbyterian schools. And later, when we look at some resource slides, you'll see the link for where you can go and read that National Memorial Student Register. Pardon me. The answer to whether there are unmarked graves at former PCC-run school sites is also yes. As you see on the screen in front of you, there was the announcement by Tesaut First Nation that they had located 17 possible unmarked burial sites through the use of ground-penetrating radar and other means of geophysical search. So those are, again, possible burial sites. But we also know, just as an example, the Regina Industrial School, where 38 burial sites were located there in a cemetery, and it was known to be a cemetery. They were unmarked, and now they are marked. That was the work of local Indigenous groups with the support of some local Presbyterians that worked on that project, and that was several years ago. So what is the church doing now? The church, the PCC has a fund that is meant to support searches, as well as things like memorials, things like healing projects, gatherings for survivors and their families, and all of that is done through the Honoring the Children Fund. It's important to note that that all projects that the fund is drawn on for are done only at the request of and only in line with the desires of the nations and the communities that were impacted by the schools. And so there are several such projects that have been done or are, and some of which are ongoing. And we continue to be in a process of working toward reconciliation and reparation in other ways as well. So that's sort of a brief backgrounder on what the church, the timeline that the church has been moving through in the last 30 years and some of the current work of the church when it comes to reconciliation and reparations. But also some of the work is within each of us. So it happens at a national, it happens at a local, at a regional basis, and it also needs to happen in each of our hearts. So we must each acknowledge our own history, which will of course be very different depending on who you are, your background, where you're coming from, your identities, and how each of our own history intersects with the church's history of profound colonial harm. That will happen in different ways. I mentioned earlier when we spoke about the apology that the apology contains at the very end of the apology, as sort of the final thing there, 5 fundamental commitments for how the church will operate, having apologized and trying to do that work of living out its apology. And so we'll take a moment and just look at those 5 fundamental commitments. The first one is we will continue to listen and learn from Indigenous people, Indigenous leaders, elders, and knowledge keepers, welcoming and engaging voices within and beyond the Presbyterian Church in Canada. So that's the first commitment that we've made, is to continuing to listen and learn. The second is we will continue the work of reconciliation, responding to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action and the work of reparation that we have begun. So again, placing ourselves in the need to respond to the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its calls to action. The third is one that excuse me, that has often been highlighted to me as one of the more important. We will respect traditional Indigenous spiritual practices. This is a form of reconciliation and is necessary for healing, is what I have heard and seen. Fourth, we will listen to and we will tell the truth about the past. And so that is one of the commitments that is framing this particular webinar today that you are participating in. And last, we will work to support Indigenous-led healing and wellness initiatives and to be in solidarity with Indigenous people and communities. So those are the 5 fundamental commitments that are at the end of the apology that the General Assembly adopted in 2024 and which guide the church's path as we move forward in reconciliation. There are other things which also guide our path and that are, I think, reflected in those 5 commitments. So what you see on the screen before you is an excerpt from Living Faith, which is, of course, a subordinate standard of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, some of our doctrine. And this is from the page on justice, that there's a whole section on justice in Living Faith. I encourage you to go look at it if you haven't had a chance to do so. God's justice, it says, is seen when we deal fairly with each other and strive to change customs and practices that oppress and enslave others. It notes that justice involves protecting the rights of others and that it protests against everything that destroys human dignity, some of which we've heard a great deal about today. Last, as one of the final parts of that section on justice, it notes that justice stands with our neighbors. So that's that solidarity that we just heard about on the previous slide. Justice stands with our neighbors in their struggle for dignity and respect and demands the exercise of power for the common good. This particular way of looking at justice, that's from Living Faith, it notes that each of us has power in different ways, what we must do with this power that each of us has in our different ways is to use that power to work together for what is good for all. And that working together for what is good for all brings us to the question that you see, and the answer really that you see to the question in front of you. We've been talking about colonialism and colonization, and we have seen the impacts, just very briefly, the impacts and harm and trauma that colonization and colonialism have caused. So when we think about those harms and what colonialism is and what it has done, and what colonization is and has done, the question, why should we work to colonize? The answer becomes very clear, and you see it in front of you. We must work to decolonize because colonialism is a sinful ideology causing profound harm that operates as a complete rejection of the gospel. So there are some important things to learn as we consider how we can do the work of trying to take apart the ways that the structures of colonialism are operating in our church, having identified it as a sinful, harmful ideology that is at odds with the gospel. Some of those things include learning about our own stories and histories and how they intersect with other people's. So learning about the history of colonization in Canada, that was something that I have been learning a lot about that I didn't know previously, so this has been a learning journey for me. Learning about the impacts of racism and how specifically not just the impacts of it, but then how to work against racism to stop it. Learning where there are things that it's necessary that we need to unlearn. So as we have grown up in, and I speak now for myself, as I've grown up in cultures and structures that are saturated by racism and colonialism, there are ways in which it has shaped each of us, and certainly myself, and things that then I need to examine and unlearn as I do the work of learning how to do reconciliation. And then last, it's important to learn not just about the church's harmful legacy, but also about the church's work to try to do better, so that we can continue trying that to listen, learn, and do better work. So learning about the church's current social justice work and what the church is doing today. You see on the screen in front of you some of the study guides that are available. And then that third thing on the screen in the bottom right-hand corner is a screenshot of the Social Action Hub, which is available online, and it will give you a history of the church's many different actions that it has taken and positions it has taken with regards to justice. As the church moves forward, we identified those 5 foundational commitments that are in the apology. And as you heard in the timeline, the church has committed itself to using the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as the framework for reconciliation, along with the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And you see those orange booklets there are copies of those 94 calls to action, but they're also available online, so you can see them there. Another important resource that's worth spending some time looking through, and there is a study guide available on the Social Action Hub to walk Presbyterians through this particular report, Reclaiming Power in Place, is the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And it has a very in-depth discussion of colonialism and how it has operated, how it has harmed Indigenous people, and also things like the 60 Scoop, and the ways that violence has taken place in the lives of Indigenous people. So I encourage everyone who hasn't had a chance already to read this report to go and do so. And there are, as I said, ways to help engage with the key elements of it available on our Social Action Hub. A last resource that I'll draw to your attention before I go into just a whole bunch of resources is the reports of the special interlocutor who is still engaged in her work, looking at the issue of unmarked burial sites at former residential schools. So you see on the screen before you 8 different reports that the special interlocutor has already released. There is, as I said, another one coming at the end of October. So please do look for that. And you can see at the top of the screen the web address where these reports can be found and downloaded. The Presbyterian Church in Canada also has some resources that are available to help ground people in some of these key issues that we've looked at, and also in some of the church's history. So you see a list of links on the screen in front of you, places you can go and learn more, or statements that the church has put out. So you can see sort of how the church has been responding, what the church has said. There's a study guide that's available on the 1994 confession. We don't have a study guide yet for the apology, but eventually that will be available. There's a whole site to learn about the doctrine of discovery, including a video that was made, so that you can watch and learn more. Different pages on anti-racism, on the schools themselves, through the archives, and some other resources there. Those were all resources that the church has created. These particular ones that you see on the screen in front of you now are from external sources. So you see the link to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action, to the National Memorial Student Register that I mentioned earlier, to progress tracking on the 94 calls to action. So you can see where not just the churches, but the governments and other organizations that the calls were issued to, where that progress is at. The link to a place where you can download that final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls is there on the screen. And the last link that you see there for the Children Remembered is a link to a United Church of Canada site that has narratives on many of the schools that the UCC ran. As you recall from the previous discussion of the schools earlier in the webinar, some of those schools were initially operated by the Presbyterians and prior to 1925. And so some of the schools that you saw on that list will be on the Children Remembered site, as the UCC holds the records for those particular schools. We're now coming up at the end of the webinar, and in a moment we'll move into a time for questions. But before we do that, I wanted to take a moment again to collect ourselves and to consider the stories, the information that we've heard here, to consider the lives of the people that it impacted, that it continues to impact, and that it will impact still. And so I'll just take a moment, again, a moment of silence while we hold all of that in our heart, and then we will then we will have a time for questions. So if you'll join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. We're now moving to some time for questions. Grace, if you would turn off the recording and open up the chat